my name's Rachel. I'm working here at the collection crew at Seed Savers, where we're managing our big collection of seeds in the seed bank. We're going to talk about watermelon processing and how to get the good old seeds out of the watermelon. So these watermelons were grown in isolation cages because watermelons are open pollinated. Bees are coming from all over and can be mixing all different types of watermelon pollen. And so these were grown in cages so that the only pollination that was happening was the pollination that we were doing ourselves. And so we make sure to very clearly label everything so that we know when it was harvested, what the variety is, what the number in our collection is, how many buckets, where it was grown, all of the information in order to be very seed savvy and keep everything on track. So we loaded up all of these and they sat for a little bit. You can process melons immediately after you harvest them, or if you want to make sure that you're spacing out your watermelon processing so that you're not mixing up seeds and getting them stuck to your clothes, that's the reason that we decided to wait a little bit to process this one. So you know that a melon is ripe, usually because it has a nice little buttery spot. This one is very buttery, very fast gone. But you can harvest it at a much earlier stage, especially if your gross tolerance is a little lower. Usually most melons just have this ripe, lighter spot on them, so they have the dark, and then this indicates that it's good to go. You can harvest it when you would eat it. You can usually wait a little bit longer and maybe a couple more seeds will develop. But watermelon seeds ripen at different times anyway, so chances are if you harvest it when it's ready to eat, that you will also have some viable seeds in there that are good to go. One thing that I always check for when I'm looking for is my melon pretty ripe is when you cut in, does it kind of have that pop sound with it? So I didn't even cut here, but it decided to split open because it was nice and ready to go. And then we find it easiest to just cut these into quarters. And when you look closely, you can see just the different stages of seed development that are in this one melon. So over here on the top, we have these like lighter, whiter seeds that are not quite ready. You see that this one wasn't even strong enough that the knife went straight through it. But then color is a great indicator. These are just so much more plump and full, and they're far stronger. And even though I cut right along the edge, the knife kind of went past them as opposed to going through them. So that's a great indicator that those are ready. So then, once I have my melon quarter, and you can cut it in half, whatever works for you. Quarters is just what we find easiest here. You just kind of take your thumb and just start scraping out the seeds. And the goal is to avoid as much flesh getting into our bucket as we can, because that saves us time later as far as picking it out. But depending on how much melon you have, you could also just eat the melon and spit out all of the seeds, and that would be a perfectly fine way to save them, and a delicious one. But if you're growing it at scale, then you can scrape it out like this. And then I like to kind of tear out these middle chunks. Woo! Okay, so usually you have a chunk in the center that's able to come off, and then you can check beneath it to see. And all different watermelon varieties are different. There are usually these like lines and bands of where the seeds are. This one actually really well demonstrates how they kind of grow in these bands, and you have this central core of seedless flesh, but then all around in these rings you're getting more of the seeds. So you can just cut off or tear off that, or you can just sort of scrape around it. But you can also see that this seed is still pretty ripe because it's nice and plump. You can see that the knife didn't cut it, and even though it's not a full dark color, it may still be ready to germinate. But you can also, it's pretty interesting to see just how, even within this melon, the seeds have a lot of variety. And also not all watermelon seeds are black, which I learned this year. So there are some watermelon seeds that are all sorts of different colors. Some, like this one, just get a darker brown. Some of them are that really, when quintessential platonic ideal of a watermelon with the nice dark seeds, black seeds, and some of them are bright white when they're fully mature. So you can usually tell because within your melon there will be at least some seeds that are fully ripe, and you can kind of see that gradient of ripeness based on how full the seed is and how dark it gets, and all of those things. So I just kind of take my thumb and I scrape through, and I'm getting out all of the seeds, and then when I scrape on both sides, I then eventually take out this middle part, and maybe we'll get some of the ones that are still stuck there. You can be very careful, you can go very quickly, just depends on what you want. And ideally, by the end, you'll have a nice little bucket of all sorts of different seeds, and hopefully as little flesh as possible.
Okay, hi. So yesterday was the day that we extracted the seeds from this watermelon, and today it is the morning after, and we have a lot of buckets of seed and flesh that you saw the process yesterday. So these buckets have been fermenting overnight, and you can take a look inside. It's pretty fleshy and pretty watery underneath. There's a lot of flesh and seeds that have floated to the top. And you can smell it, but not over video. That it's a little bit, definitely got that fermenty tinge to it. So watermelons are not a crop that you need to ferment. They do not have a gelatinous envelope around the seeds in the same way that tomatoes and cucumbers, for example, do. But we have found that fermenting the watermelon seeds with their flesh and juice for a few hours or overnight is really helpful to help us screen out the flesh and rinse the seeds. So it's really not critical in terms of making sure that the seed germination is not inhibited, but it does make this process a lot easier. And if you're working on a small scale, it's pretty easy to kind of pick out the big chunks. But on our scale, it's a lot easier to ferment everything so that those flesh chunks are a little bit more broken down, and they will break down really easily through the power of water pressure that you'll see in a second here. So I have a screen device, which you can use your whatever you have lying around. The important thing here is that it is a screen size that the seeds will not go through. So I want the flesh and the sugar water to go through, but I want to keep the seeds in this screen. And I'm working here with this little outdoor sink setup, which is really not necessary, but it just makes it so that I can stand up nicely and not have to sit on a chair and bend over. But you can do whatever setup works for you. And I have another colander here that we'll use at the end of the process. It's even smaller, and I just like it to help dry the seeds as much as I can before I lay them out to dry for a few days. So we'll see that in action. So the first step is to pour a bunch of seeds into my first colander. So we're getting a lot of flesh and big chunks and seeds. You can see the watermelon juice really just rinsing through. I'm going to use a setting on my hose nozzle that is a pretty direct and powerful setting. I definitely prefer using a hose with a nozzle to working with like a sink faucet, because we need that pressure to push the flesh through the screen and really pulverize the flesh. So there's not much action right at the beginning. But after a while, you can start to see the area that I'm focusing the water pressure on. You're starting to see just seeds rather than flesh. And then I kind of work my way around the colander, pushing that flesh through the screen and breaking it down with the water. So now we work our way all the way through that colander, and you can see that very little flesh remains with the seeds. And we'll just pour it out into our other colander, and maybe pick through and grab some big chunks that we don't want. But it's pretty clean, pretty good to go. So normally what I do is do that a whole bunch of times and fill this up a little bit more. But then I set my hose nozzle to the shower setting, which is a lot more water in more area, a little bit more gentle. And I just like to do another final rinse to make sure that the seeds just don't have any sugars left on them with like the water that's around them. So just a nice gentle rinse. There shouldn't be any more flesh in there really, but it's really just rinsing the water to make sure that it's not sugary water. And then since we're gonna set these seeds to dry, just try to shake off as much water as I can at this point so that they can dry faster. We want these seeds to dry as quick as possible so that they don't start germinating or grow any mold on them, anything like that. So that's pretty good, and now we'll go inside and lay these on our screen to dry. Okay, so here we are with our drying the seeds out setup. What you need for your setup is some type of screen. We use these old window screens, and it works really well for our lots of seed that are bigger, but you can use colanders or other things that you have around your house. And then we also put these screens up on little deli tubs, and that helps so that there's air movement underneath the seeds as well as above them, and they dry out a lot faster that way. And then you also need a fan. That is really helpful to, again, we're trying to dry the seeds out faster. And if you have a space that is protected from sunlight, like mice and things like that, and humidity, if you can protect the seeds from humidity while they're drying out, that's really great. But we work with what we got. This space does actually get kind of humid sometimes during the summer. So we're making it work, and we're all just making it work. So yeah, we're gonna take our seeds and just lay them out on the screen. And you can see, like Rachel mentioned earlier, that there is a variety of colors in this seed, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I'll end up putting quite a bit more seeds on this screen, but you don't want to put too many seeds. You don't want to make the layer too thick, because again, then they won't dry as quickly. Yeah, and then very important seed keeping step is to put your label on it. So we take lots of notes on what the crop is so that we can track it. We track our harvest dates, and I'll write today's date on this tag too, saying that we processed it today. And then The last thing here is that we have another screen that we'll put on top. So this protects from mice or other pests and anything that's like might fall on the seeds. Other seeds might fall onto these seeds, so it's just nice to cover your seeds as they're drying. And then, like I said, we'll turn this fan on and they'll dry for a few days. Each day we'll come and stir the seeds and like break up those chunks so that every seed can dry well across its whole surface, because these seeds will kind of dry stuck to each other. Even though they don't have sugars and things, they will dry in clumps if you don't do that stirring every day. Yeah, so then after they're dry enough, we will package them up and put them in another space that is more humidity and temperature controlled. And you might be asking, what's dry enough? What's dry enough to take them off the screen? Great question. So we like to do the snap test. That's a very common test for wet seeded crops. And for watermelons, they're pretty tough when you try to break them. But that snap test is you want the seed to snap when you try to break it. And so if you notice that the seed is kind of bending and then breaking before it doesn't actually snap, then you want to let it dry out on the screen for longer. And so yeah, we're going for that snap. So then you'll take the seeds out, like I said, and in our processes, we'll do winnowing at the end to really blow off any seeds that are not fully mature and are light, that embryo is not fully developed, and then we can have a higher germination percentage. And yeah, it saves on storage space because you don't have a bunch of empty seeds laying around. So like I said, with the color differences that we're seeing in this variety, it'll be kind of an interesting thing. I'm speculating that the darker seeds are the ones that will stay and a lot of the lighter seeds will blow off. But I've also noticed some lighter seeds that look plump and look fully developed. So it'll be a cool thing to see what happens when we winnow this variety. It's, every variety is a little bit different, so it's fun to see how it will go. And I think that pretty much concludes all of the fleshy processing of watermelons. Thanks.